Hi, my name is Connie Arzigian, and I work with the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. I'm talking to you today about chipped stones, how we can recognize whether they were made by humans or whether there were some processes of nature that were working them. So I want to start by talking about what is a chipped stone. We have here a piece of material that's got a very uniform texture to it. So if I take one of my tools, either this antler or a hammerstone, I can hit this at just the right angle. It's a demo, so I'm not going to actually do it. Hit it at just the right angle and knock off a flake that will have some very distinctive characteristics that tell me it's a human. So the flake itself will leave a bulb. It'll leave a depression at the top where the flake came off, where I hit it. And the flake itself will have very sharp edges. This itself is a perfectly good tool, and it has a very distinctive characteristic. It also has a very distinctive bump or a bulb on there. So we're going to track that same characteristic to some different things that were clearly made by humans, some that were made by natural processes of stones just rolling. We're going to look at some edge damage that's done deliberately to make a tool, sometimes aspects that were done by nature, compare a couple of artifacts with those different kinds of criteria, and then look at some different ways that stones might break, either in use or in manufacture. So check the description box for timestamps for particular segments that you want to go to, and you can also check out some of the other videos in our series for different aspects about chipped stones. Thank you. Humans are chipping these stones in order to make something. So we have here an example of a very nice knife that's being made, and you can see there's a systematic series of flake removals coming from each face. So when we talk about a biface, we're talking about working on both faces and then on multiple edges of it, the two edges on the outside. So we have a systematic series of flakes to shape this. And this stone is pretty far along. It's had a lot of different flake removals to make this, and it's got a very nice and aligned edge right here. This is a very sharp edge. This would have been a very good tool for somebody to work with. Each of these flakes sets up a platform for the other. You take off a flake here, then you would turn it over and you would take off the flake from the opposite side that's following these other ridges. We have a nice shaped stone here. Some stones are being worked to get the flakes. So this stone is pretty lumpy, it's pretty thick, and people weren't trying to make this into something, they were trying to get the flakes. So as I said before, flakes are really sharp, they're really good tools. Many things are done just by flake tools, and this core has a series of different large flakes removed off of it in order to work the flakes, in order to actually just get the raw materials for the flakes. And we can see many of them that are taken off of both sides, but they're not working both faces to shape this. They're working it to get flakes, to work all those different flakes. And sometimes we will find tools that are very heavily used. This material, this is an artifact that was very heavy. It was chipped around the edges, but then it was used very heavily, probably in a chopping motion to crush and cut, because the edges are really battered. But if you look on the edges, they had the systematic series of flake removals to start with that shaped both faces of the stone. And this one is a ringer. A friend gave us this, and they knew where it came from. They had found it at the bottom of a rock crusher. It looks very much like a human might have been working it, but we know where it was. We know that it wasn't a human, it was a rock crusher. And if you look carefully at it, you can see that it's not quite right. There's crushing on the edges, but it's not the same way we saw with this stone crushing on a working edge. It's just kind of battered in some places. There are no systematic bulbs. There are fractures and there are broken planes, but they're not the systematic dips that we saw with the cultural fractures. They're just shearing across natural fracture planes. And you can see here that there's a series of just kind of chatter that's shearing fracture planes, but it's not actually chipping them. And the same thing with this. The dip is not at a place where somebody could have removed that flake. It's too steep of an angle, and it doesn't have the nice shaped bulb. Some of these, there are a couple of bulbs here that might look a little bit confusing, but all in all, it's not quite right. It doesn't have quite the right structure. It doesn't have good bulb removals systematically taken off of it. It would have been very hard to recognize it's not cultural if somebody hadn't told us that, but once you start looking at it, it's not right. It has places where it was being hit, which is what a rock crusher does, and just kind of shattering it on flat planes rather than chipping it. So when we see a stone that's got these systematic flake removals, it could be to shape it into something like this knife, or it could be to remove the flakes, but it will have, at least some of them are going to be clearly culturally made bulbs of percussion. So showing the negative bulbs on these stones, and then showing the positive bulbs on the flakes themselves. Flakes are one of the most useful items that prehistoric peoples would have been using. The edges are sharp. You can pick one of these up. You can butcher a deer. We've done experiments. It takes 3 flakes to butcher a deer, and they are just extremely fast to make and very easy to use. We can also take the flakes and start modifying them in various ways to get different kinds of tools. And so we've talked about bifaces that are worked on both faces of the stone, the top and the bottom of the stone. When we have a uniface, like a scraper that we have here, it's worked on one face. So you can see that the ventral surface on this is a flake. It's got a bulb of percussion. And then the rest of the surface is smooth. But then the dorsal surface has a series of very carefully removed flakes to shape this edge, and in particular to shape this tip, so that this has careful work across all of that area so that it could be used as a scraper, both as a side scraper and as an end scraper, to be moving through to preparing hides and work like that. And they could have done this either with an antler, so that they would take this and they could flake across from the ventral surface going down onto the dorsal surface to remove this whole series of flakes, and they could control the flaking that way. They could also use a pressure flaker. They could literally get onto the edge and press these little flakes down in order to knock them off. So we've got a number of different ways that they could be making these. So modified flakes are extremely common and very useful, could be made in a few minutes and would work very well. Some of these more formally made tools, this beautifully made scraper, this is an archaeological specimen that was probably used for a fair period of time. It's really nicely made. These may have been hafted. We have an example here of an experimental one that a student at UWL hafted in order to show how it would actually work. And she simply split a piece of wood and inserted it in there, which is a nice quick and dirty way of doing it, but it also makes a very sturdy haft. It's tied with sinew so that it will stay on there, and we're going to be using this so we can see how it works as a hide scraper. So where you can see very clearly with this hafted scraper that there are places where the sinew is running over the edge of the scraper. And if your flake is razor sharp at that point, it's just going to cut right on through. So these flakes are really sharp. So what you have to do on the edges where the sinew is going to run over is dull them. So this is an example of an archaeological end scraper. It's the same design as the modern one, but this edge right here doesn't have systematic flakes on it. They literally took a piece of sandstone probably and ground it to dull it so they could run a haft over it. Or if they were holding it in their hands, the point where that's hitting in there isn't going to actually cut their hand. So these are ways that we can see systematic removal of flakes. Sometimes we'll find damage on a flake that's a result of the fact that the flake was in the ground, it was knocking around, it was hitting other things. So damage to flakes is not going to have the systematic flake removals. It's just going to be tiny little irregular chips coming off of the edge. Most of the time, they're going to be a result of impact of two different flakes that are hitting at a perpendicular angle, so they're leaving irregular marks on the edge, kind of jagged edges, but they're not the systematic flake removals that we would see from one of our archaeological specimens. This is another example of a really well-used scraper that was probably handheld that has a lot of small flakes taken off of the edge. Probably it was used, a lot of these flakes came off in using it, and the edge just got very dull from use. This final example is an interesting example of a artifact. It was a flake at some point. It fell into the river, got water-worn, but then it got picked up again, and people did a little bit of work on the edge. They picked this up and actually started working some of these edges on here. So it's mostly a water-worn piece of stone that has a little bit of work on the edge, and much of this edge feels fresh, so this happened after this came out of the rock, out of the river from there. But otherwise, you'll see this surface over here, the crushing and the grinding on the margin is still very smooth and still very polished. So this happened prior to the water-worn surface. And because this was found in an archaeological context, we know that a human picked it up. But this little bit of damage here could also have happened when it was just rolling in the river and it was just getting a few little chips knocked off of it. Because it is water-worn over all of the rest of the surface, it clearly spent most of its life in the water. Here we have 3 examples of artifacts that broke by humans, but not quite the way they intended. So this first one is a very nicely made projectile point. It has lots of beautiful flake scars taken across it on both faces, and you can see that the base has been ground. This was probably a finished point that had been hafted. It's very well made. It's actually very thin, and this would have been in a haft and probably at the end of a dart or a spear, and at some point it impacted something and it just shattered halfway across and broke the blade. So they would not have been happy. This artifact was being made, and they got pretty far. They were pretty late in this whole process. And we can see that there's lots of beautiful flake scars across this, lots of fine work, shaping the edge, and they were trying to work this last edge over here, and there was one corner that was just not quite right, and they set up a platform and they hit and they knocked off the whole corner. So we end up with a snap, called this a hinge fracture. There's a snap across the area rather than the bulb of percussion that they were aiming for. So the flake itself has a kind of an odd curvature to it, and the artifact has this snap across it. This final item is earlier in the stages of production. It has a number of flakes taken off of it. We have a nice bulb of percussion from there. We have bulbs coming off of the surface here. We have another one coming off of here. So they were working it. This corner right here was very thick. They couldn't do much with it. They hit it, and it fractured much further than they intended, and it fractured across what was probably a natural fracture plane. This is an irregularity in the stone that had gotten a little weak. It looks like water would have gotten in there, and there was a natural crack. So when they hit it, it broke across that natural crack. It didn't break where they wanted it to. It broke where the stone was weakest. So people would have been very conscious of such irregularities in the stone to make sure that that wouldn't happen to them. This collection of stones has some that are clearly natural stones. We have little agates that are little water-worn pebbles all around, and they don't show any signs of fresh breaks. So water-worn will give you a very waxy feel to the material. This material here, this item here, is fractured. It's got angular breaks on it, but it also has that water-worn polish. And the breaks that are on here are not quite right for human work. So although it's fractured, it has some angles. They're kind of sharp angles. They're not true flakes on there. And the water-worn, the waxy feel over all of the surface says that this material was not actually broken by a human, at least not before it went into the water and was then seriously modified by other events. This one kind of looks like a human made it. It's got that shape, but this is something that a modern person did. We found this on a field, but somebody modern made this. It's got grinding marks on the edge where somebody took a file and literally ground the shape of this down so that they could get the shape that they wanted. And we can see in some places where they're making a flat surface for it, they're working the edge on there. They're literally taking a file or a drill and they're grinding this surface. So the rest of the rock is smooth. It has irregularities, but there aren't any true chips on it. And the modifications, you'll notice, are also in a lighter color because of when you've removed the outer patina of the stone, you end up with a lighter color inside. So all the places where there's been modern grinding, it's also a lighter color, so it marks those out. When you see some of these stones that have been uniformly rolled in water, they're all a uniform color because the same patina is formed over all the surface. Here we have two items, one of which is cultural and one of which is natural. They both look pretty similar, but we can look at the edges and we can see how each of these is different. So if we look at the cultural artifact, it has a series of flakes that came off of each edge. There's a negative bulb of percussion there, there's a negative bulb of percussion there, there's a bulb over here and here and here. If we turn it sideways, we have some very clear bulbs of percussion coming off and shaping this edge. We have a kind of a sinuous edge going down there with a series of flakes going across the surface. And the same thing with this. This is a little bit tighter edge, but it still has chips that have been taken off of both faces. If we look at this item, the edges are kind of irregular, but they don't have systematic flake scars. They have just kind of damage. They have something that hit it, probably perpendicular, and damaged the edges. There are no flake scars that come off of this surface. The surface is smooth. This surface here, again, is irregular, but it's not systematically flaked. And if we look at this side, again, doesn't have flake scars on it. It just has some natural material and natural irregularities. So when we compare both of these, we can see that there are systematic differences between these. And particularly here, we can see how one edge is much straighter and doesn't have the systematic flake removals that we have from this object. So this one is cultural and this one is natural. So now you have some idea how to compare an artifact that a human made and the specific traits that show us that a human knocked off the flakes versus what happens when stones are rolled in the ground and nature forms and knocks off parts of the stone. You can understand how characteristics of the stone that were used to make this into an ancient tool with the edges modified versus what happens when nature is working on it or when modern humans take a drill to things. You can compare a couple of artifacts that look vaguely similar, but have very distinctive characteristics. So we can tell one is natural and one is made by humans. Sometimes artifacts break. We can talk about why that happened, and you'll be able to recognize any of the aspects of a humanly made flake. Again, one of the sharpest and most useful tools. So if you're looking for more information about the cultures, check out MVAC's webpage, and that will also have links for the state archaeologists across the United States. So if you do find an artifact, you find a site, you want to report it, there'll be information there on how to do that. Thank you.